was 1967. It was in 1967, with the 1967 war, that the U.S.-Israel relations were solidified in pretty much their current form, with the change from before, and a new framework was established in the region. So what happened in 67? Well, in the background was a war that was going on between radical Islamism and secular nationalism in the Arab world. The radical Islamism is centered in Saudi Arabia, the most extreme fundamentalist Arab state, with the Wahhabism, the most extreme form of Islam, that supporters of jihad, the missionary movement, and so on. That's centered in Saudi Arabia. So that's radical Islam, of course. At that time, secular nationalism was centered in Egypt, Nasser's Egypt. There was a war going on between Saudi Arabia and Egypt, a proxy war in Yemen, and it was serious. The United States and Britain have traditionally supported radical Islam, almost always. Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, supported the formation of Hamas. It's very consistent. The U.S. has been a very strong, Britain too, a very strong supporter of radical Islamism. And there's a reason, because they consider it a barrier to secular nationalism. And secular nationalism is the real threat, not only in the Middle East, but everywhere. For example, secular nationalism might involve a move towards real independence and towards taking over the resources of the region and using them for its own population instead of for the West and for ruling gangsters. And that's a threat. So very consistently, the U.S. and Britain have supported radical Islam, Israel too. In '67, Israel effectively destroyed secular nationalism. That was the main outcome of the war, and defended Saudi Arabia, defended radical Islam. And that was a big plus for U.S. policy. And relations with Israel changed most totally at that time. Militarily, diplomatically, ideologically, all kinds of ways. Well, that was continuous, but after that, in 1970, a couple years later, the Jordan U.S.-backed dictatorship in Jordan was carrying out a real massacre of Palestinians. Black September was called. It looked for a while as though Syria might intervene to prevent the massacre. The U.S. was pretty upset about that. But the U.S. at the time was completely bogged down in Southeast Asia. It just invaded Cambodia. Things were totally impossible. Couldn't do anything. It called on Israel to react. Israel mobilized its quite formidable military forces. Syria backed off. And that was considered a positive step in protecting the Hashemite monarchy and also the Saudi Arabian monarchy. And in fact, the U.S. aid to Israel quadrupled, practically quadrupled that year. And it sort of continued in the Nixon was president, and there was a Nixon doctrine, so-called, and the Nixon doctrine was that the way that the U.S. ought to have surrogate states carrying out the dirty work, couldn't do everything by ourselves anymore. And in the Middle East, there had to be what were called cops on the beat. The cops on the beat who keep the place under control had to be non-Arab. They do a better job of killing Arabs. So Pakistan, Iran, the Shah, Turkey, Israel, they're the cops on the beat. Police headquarters, of course, is in Washington, and there's a branch office in London. That's essentially part of the region. And Israel was joined as one of the cops on the beat at that time. And that's stayed pretty much like that. It became critical in 1971. That was one of the most important moments in Israel's history, I think. In 1971, the new president of Egypt, President Sadat, offered Israel a full peace treaty. Nothing for the Palestinians. The Palestinian issue hadn't really reached the international agenda then. So Palestinians, some words about refugees. the quid pro quo was that Israel was to withdraw from Arab territory, and in fact, Egypt only cared about Egyptian territory from the occupied Sinai. Actually, Jordan came along a year later with a similar proposal from the West Bank. Well, Israel had a choice at that point, a crucial choice, and they made a fateful decision, I think. They could have had almost total security. A peace treaty with Egypt and Jordan, nothing for the Palestinians, Syrians out of the game. That's essentially as much security as you can get in this world. The alternative, and they had to decide, do we want security or do we want expansion? Well, the primary expansion at that time was into Egypt. It was into the Egyptian Sinai. Israel at that time was driving thousands, tens of thousands of farmers out of the Sinai. They were laying plans to build a big city on the ocean, million people, a lot of settlements and so on. And they decided they'd rather have expansion than security. The question is, what would the U.S. do, as always? And the U.S. went along to Kissinger supported that. That's what he called stalemate in his memoirs. No negotiations, just force. Well, that had a lot of consequences. The one consequence that led to the '73 war, which was a very close thing for Israel. Another is it set the stage for what amounts to, I have time to go into the details, but since then there's been essentially permanent choice of accepting expansion over security. Israel could have security right now, accepting the international consensus, but they want expansion. And now it's primarily in the West Bank and the illegally annexed Golan Heights, which we won't talk about. The Security Council declared it illegal, but the U.S. didn't care, so Israel doesn't. And that remains the situation until 71-72. In January 1976, the major Arab states, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, neighboring states, wrote a resolution to the Security Council calling for a two-state settlement. By then, the Palestinian issue had reached the international agenda. So they called for a two-state settlement on the international border, the recognized international border, so-called Green Line. And then the resolution added the standard wording of the major diplomatic documents, UN 242, recognition of the rights of every state in the region to live in peace and security within secure and recognized borders. It's basically the resolution. The U.S. vetoed it. Vetoed a similar resolution in 1980. The Security Council was ruled out, shifted to the General Assembly, and then you get these annual votes with 151 to 3 and so on, year after year. The most recent one is February. The next one will be this winter session, very likely. Well, that's meanwhile, settlement expansion continued. And the Oslo agreements came along in 1993. It was a total disaster for the Palestinians, quite predictably. I don't say it in retrospect, or about it immediately because it was obvious. The pace of settlement increased steadily right through the 90s. After the peak year was year 2000, was last year. Gaza was closed off, separated from the West Bank in violation of the Oslo Treaty, and that's been U.S.-Israeli policy since. I'll quote Amira Haas, one of Israel's leading journalists, wonderful journalist, and also their main specialist on Gaza. She's been there for years. And she writes that the total separation of the Gaza Strip from the West Bank is one of the greatest achievements of Israeli politics, whose overarching objective is to prevent a solution based on international decisions and understandings, and instead dictate an arrangement based on Israel's military superiority, and the U.S. backs it. That's very bitter. It means that students in Gaza, for example, can't go a couple of miles to the universities in the West Bank. Patients who have to go to the Jerusalem hospital pretty much far. People can't visit their families a couple of kilometers away. And meanwhile, repression intensified in Gaza was reduced to misery. Well, in 2005 came the famous disengagement. Israel had about 7,000 settlers illegally in Gaza, using a large part of the meager resources on land, maybe 30–40%, and defended by the big mass of the Israeli army. And General Sharon, who was prime minister, hawkish Israeli leader, he recognized rationally that it just made no sense to keep a small number of Jewish settlers in Gaza, which by then had been utterly devastated. It used to be a pretty wealthy place, but totally destroyed by then. So that was pointless. It made a lot more sense to take them out and send them to settle illegally in the West Bank, which Israel wants. So that was the disengagement, but you couldn't present it that way. So a farce was enacted, a really comical farce. If Israel, they could have just done it very easily. They could have just said, you know, on August 1st, the IDF, the army, is going to withdraw from Gaza. And at that point, the 7,000 or 8,000 settlers would have climbed into the lorries that were provided for them and be taken from their illegally subsidized homes in Gaza to their illegally subsidized homes in the West Bank. That would have been the end of it. But that was no good. You had to have a PR operation. So what they staged is correct, was a confrontation. So you get front page newspaper pictures, you know, of a little boy pleading with the army not to destroy his home and so on, and then the cries of never again, you know, Holocaust, we have to stay in the West Bank forever. It was such a transparent farce that it was ridiculed in Israel. And what made it even more of a farce was it was a replay of something